Hey guys, welcome back to this second part of the Transformers title tutorial. In this video, we're gonna have a look at texturing and lighting this little title in Redshift. Then we're gonna hop in After Effects and I will comment on what I did in there. We're gonna use two textures for the letters, this first one and this one. So first, I'm gonna create a new Redshift material. I'm gonna call this Redshift Metal. I'm gonna import my textures. And we're gonna mix those textures. So I'm gonna look for a color composite node, which will allow us to multiply the textures. I'm gonna add this on the fracture. I'm gonna delete the other textures. I'm gonna add it to the inside. And from here, we're gonna add some lights. I'm going to Redshift and select Area Lights. I'm gonna add a new null. I'm gonna call this Lights. We're gonna have the camera on this side. So what I'm going for here is a sort of rim light, which will give us some reflections on the edges. We're gonna open up the IPR. So remember we did this connect to fracture the objects and the little cubes are appearing in the render. So I'm gonna hide this. I'm gonna call this light back. I'm gonna control drag this one. I'm gonna call it light left, because I would like to have a big light on the left side. This is the very base of the lighting. I'm gonna control drag once more. And I'm gonna call this one light front. I'm gonna get out of the camera view, rotate my front light. And I'm gonna set it to be on the bottom right side. So going back to the camera view, I don't want it to be in the frame, so I'm just gonna move it back down. So we can see we have a little issue on the chamfers. I'm gonna disable the use edge breaks, and for the fong angle, I'm gonna set it to 40. So we get our nice little chamfers. So to add some volumetric lights, we're gonna go to Redshift, Objects, Redshift Environment. So we're gonna increase the contribution scale. We're gonna set this to 0.05. So the effect is depending on different things. We have this value that we have in each light. If I deactivate the front light, we don't have nothing anymore. So for each light, we're gonna have this setting. We're gonna have a second setting in the environment, which is called scattering. If I set this one to 0.5, we get something that's blown out. So I'm gonna set this back to 0.01. The effect is depending on the intensity of the light too. If I set this to 3, the light is gonna have more influence. So in fact, we got these 3 parameters: the light intensity, the contribution scale, and the volume, and the scattering. And so these 3 parameters are going to play together to get this effect. So when I select one of the nodes, I can go to Tools and Connect Node to Output, which naturally connects the nodes to the output. And so we're gonna see the result of the nodes. We can go to Window, Customization, Customize Commands. So here I'm looking for the Connect Node to Output. And here we're gonna be able to set a shortcut for that. So I'm gonna set this aside of the textures. So here we're gonna be able to change the textures and see the IPR at the same time. You could have used a mode text instead of using a simple extruded text spline. But the issue with the mode text, if I come closer to the letters, the exact same texture is applied on each letter. On the second text, you see that the texture is covering the whole word from left to right. So this is why I use the text spline, which is better. So I'm gonna connect the composite to the output. The composite is set to multiply. Then I'm gonna look for a ramp. So we're gonna be able to correct the texture with that. I'm gonna use these textures as masks. I'm gonna connect the ramp to the output. And for the source, we wanna select Alt. Setting this to Alt will enable us to remap or to invert the colors. I'm gonna move the white on the left. I'm gonna set the interpolation to be linear. And I'm gonna move the black to be more on the left. Okay, so then we're gonna be looking for a noise. I'm gonna keep my noise type to be fractal. I'm gonna remap the colors of the noise. This will be 0.48. This one 0.7. I'm gonna control drag the noise, connect it to the output. Here I'm gonna change the coordinates. I'm gonna scale the noise. I'm gonna change this to 8, 2, and 32. I'm gonna control drag the composite. So I'm gonna connect both noises, set the mode to screen, and I connect this to the output. Then I'm gonna look for a change range. Then we're gonna remap these values. I'm gonna set the new max range to 5. Then we're gonna look for a curvature. This one is really interesting. If I connect this directly to the output, this will create a ramp depending of the normal angles between two polygons. We can get some outlines. We could increase the radius. We can go further with that. And this is why we did this little noise setup. And this is what we're gonna connect to the radius. And we're gonna use the noise that we created previously to drive the radius of the curvature. This is looking way better, I think. So depending on the noises we feed in, we're gonna have some different values on the edges. I'm gonna add in a new ramp. I connect the curvature and I set the source to be on Alt. We can now invert the values again. And we're gonna be able to adjust those edges. We're gonna control drag this one because it's on multiplier already. And we're gonna multiply these two values. So I'm gonna come back to this value. I think the black isn't dark enough. I'm gonna add a new change range here. So we're gonna have something with more contrast. The next step is to create two different materials. So here we get the base material. So I'm gonna connect this to the output. For the inside part, we're gonna have some iron. I'm just gonna use the preset. Then we want some paint on top of the iron. So I'm gonna control drag the material. I'm gonna connect it and I'm gonna change this one to be plastic. I'm gonna increase the roughness to 0.5. So on the iron, you're gonna have more reflection, and on the plastic, we can set the reflection weight to 0.5 just to have something less reflective. Then I'm gonna use a material blender. I'm gonna use the iron as a base material. And I'm gonna connect the plastic to the layer color 1. So we have two layers, the iron and then the plastic on top. I'm gonna rename them iron and paint. So if I connect the material blender like that, I'm gonna get only the iron. If I add some color to the paint, we don't see nothing. So what we are missing here is the blend color. So I'm gonna move this a bit. And for the blend color, we're gonna use the mask we did before. So for the paint, I want a dark gray. So I think we have too much metal here. So here you can see we have some issue. I think that's coming from this last change range. So I'm gonna connect the ramp directly to the composite. So we're gonna get rid of that change range just before the last composite. I'm gonna uncheck the environment for a sec. I'm gonna adjust my ramp on the textures just to have something sharper. Maybe we could add some bump. So I'm gonna use the mask to generate the bump. We're gonna add a bump map. So we're gonna use the mask as an input and the bump map. I'm gonna connect this to the paint in the overall bump input. So looking at the full material, this makes more sense. This is like adding some thickness to the paint. For the inside part, we're gonna make a second material. I'm gonna call this one RS inside. And I'm gonna apply that to the inside. So instead of using a paint, I'm gonna remove the paint material and I'm gonna simply drag and drop the iron. I'm gonna connect this one to layer 1. I'm gonna connect this in the bump input and we're gonna make some changes to this second iron. I'm gonna set the reflection to 0.5. I'm gonna reduce the height scale on the bump. So I don't know if the bump is really useful. Maybe the reflection weight can be 0.8. And I think I don't want to use the bump on this one. Maybe I want the reflection to be darker, so I'm gonna set the value to 80. And on this one, I'm gonna set the value to 80 as well. So I'm gonna add a redshift camera tag. For the focus object, we're gonna use the camera pivot. In the camera tag, we're gonna go to the bokeh tab and we're gonna enable it. So I'm gonna increase the radius. I'm really gonna increase the intensity of the backlight to make the edges pop a little more. I'm gonna increase its size a little bit. With only the front light, it looks like this. I'm quite okay with that. With the left only, it's looking like this. And this is the backlight. I think we need some more light. I'm gonna increase the intensity of the left light to 4. And I'm gonna do the same for the front light. And I'm gonna reduce the contribution scale on this one. I'm increasing the size of this front light. I think the volume scattering of the environment is too big. I will try 0.001, which is too little. I'm gonna increase to 0.005. I think the title reads better like that. Compared to what I did in the little demo video, the inside was darker. I'm gonna try to have less reflection on this one. I'm gonna set the weight to 0.5. And this one, I'm gonna set it to 0.3. So what we could add at this point in the render settings. So first I'm gonna change the renderer to be redshift. And I'm gonna enable the motion blur. So to see the motion blur, we're gonna go to the render view. So if I just launch the previs like that, we won't have the motion blur. Let me just scroll to a frame which should have some motion blur. I'm gonna deactivate the bokeh so we don't get confused. Everything is in focus. If I now click on render, here we're gonna see the motion blur. As you see, it's really noisy. And the only way to remove this noise is to change the unified sampling. And we're gonna increase the sample max. In fact, there is no override like for the volume or for the lights and so on. So we really have to use the unified sampling to correct that. And finally, the last thing we want to do is this light sweep on the reflections. So we're going to add a new null, which will be the highlight. So for the highlight, we're going to just copy one of our array lights. So I'm going to deactivate everything else. I'm going to place this one in front of the text. I want this to be really thin. And I'm going to rotate it a little bit. I'm going to increase its intensity, maybe 10. I'm going to duplicate this one more time. And I want this one to be looking down. I'm going to align it with the other one. So I'm going to increase it this way and reduce its size on this side. I do that to increase the highlight on the edge. I really don't want it to add light on the front side. So I'm going to reduce it even more. I'm going to rotate it slightly and move it back. So this is exactly what I was looking for. So I'm going to decrease this one and I'm going to get it closer to the text. So I'm going to lock this view again. So I'm going to move it back. So this way we're going to have a more localized reflection. Next, we want to adjust the timing. So we got every piece is coming together. And at this frame, we want the highlight passing through. I'm going to add a keyframe here. Moving back in time, I'm going to move the highlight to the left. Something like that. At the end, we want the highlight to get out of the frame again. I'm going to adjust the curves. So right-click animation, show F-curve. For this middle key, I'm going to add a ease, and I'm going to rotate this a little bit so the highlight will slow down but keep moving. So here I'm going to rotate this handle like this. And for the first one, we're going to rotate it the other way. So let's see. Okay, it's almost there. So like this, it's not too bad. And maybe we want this highlight happening a little sooner. Last thing, in this highlight, we want to add a plane. So this will be the reference. I'm going to add an external compositing tag and I'm going to export a solid to After Effects. This little highlight effect is done with the Null Light Factory plugin. So in After Effects, we're going to use this reference to have the lens flare following the plane. I'm going to move it where I want my light to happen. I'm going to mask it. So let's hop into After Effects. Some words about what I did in comp. Here we can see what's coming out of cinema. I made a copy of this layer. I add a curve just to get the brighter parts of the image, a small Gaussian blur. The opacity is 20%, and I'm going to add this to the original layer. Then I got a kind of lens flare going through. Here the opacity is 25%. So once more, this is added to the other layers. So this is just another copy of my base layer. I scaled it up and I rotated it. I added a curve and a very strong directional blur. So this will give us this little effect. So I did the same on a second one. So this one, I made it even bigger. I didn't rotate it. Here the opacity is 5%. So this adds a really subtle effect, still using a curve and a directional blur. So this gives us some more streaks. So with everything on, it looks like this. So here I just add an effect layer with another curve. So I'm just using the red curve on this one and I lower it down. So this gives us this greenish color. And I play with the opacity to adjust the effect. So here I have a second effect layer with a S-curve. On this one, we have an opacity of 100%. So this adds a little more contrast. This second S-curve is exactly the same. Here I have an opacity of 50%. So this is just to tune the colors a little more precisely. I'm just adding a vignette. So this is just another effect layer with another curve, and I'm just using that to reduce the overall luminosity. So I'm just adding a mask on this layer. So with the layer selected, I just double click on the mask. So this will give us an elliptic mask that's exactly the size of the layer. So I'm just feathering this mask. Then on top of that, I'm just adding some noise. And this is just because usually when you add some vignette like that or some gradients in After Effects, you're gonna get bending. And so the noise is just helping to break this bending effect. So it's always nice to have just a little bit of noise. The opacity on this effect is only 5%. So I'm just using the base parameters on this grain. And finally, we got the null effect. And here, as you can see, we get a real After Effects light. The light effect is this lens flare layer. The plane that you can see here is the reference plane that we have in Cinema. So if I now import my C4D file, and I copy that into my comp, we're gonna be able to use Cineware to extract some elements. On the C4D file, I'm just gonna change the frames per second to match the composition. I'm gonna set this to 25. So this is not exactly the same file I used to export the video, but if you use the same file, everything will align properly. So if I select the C4D file here, I can hit extract, and here we're gonna get everything that we set up in Cinema, like the camera, for example, and the plane. So this is the solid that's generated by the external compositing tag. So in After Effects, we're gonna get this solid. So here the solid is exactly in the same position that what we have in C4D. And in Light Factory, we're gonna be able to use lights as sources. So I created a light and I linked it to the plane. And so this way, the light is really following what we have in C4D. We just have to call this light light. So Light Factory knows it's the source of the effect. I'm just adding some keyframes on the brightness. Here it's 0. We're gonna go to 100%. And at the end, it's again 0%. What we could have done without this plugin is doing something like what we did before. Duplicate this one, for example, move it here. I'm just gonna set the opacity to 100% to see. So this is a cheaper version, but it can do the job, I guess. I'm gonna reduce the scale. We could move it like that. Make another copy. Here I'm just gonna change the scale on Y. And really increase on the X direction. Here I'm gonna alt click the opacity and link it to the other one. I'm gonna add a mask, so we just have this line. I'm gonna duplicate it once more. For this scale, I'm gonna set both to 100. I'm adding a Gaussian blur. Set this to vertical. I'm gonna add another copy and I'm gonna decrease the directional blur and increase the Gaussian blur. So here we're gonna have the mask that's becoming visible. I'm just hitting F to go to the feathering parameters. So I'm just copying the mask, increasing the feathering. Okay, so you get the idea. We're just gonna add keyframes on the opacity. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, just add it in the comments. See you in the next video. Bye.